So guys, I have been over my family leave doing something I don't normally do, and that's listening to a lot of The Daily, because my wife is a committed daily listener of The Daily, whereas I only pop in and out occasionally. And I've noticed something they do that may be the secret to their success I think we should steal.
Is it the intro where he goes, "I'm Michael Barbaro"?
Michael Barbaro. It's the way he says Barbaro.
Exactly.
Yes, I do love
Michael
that.
Barbaro.
I find that incredibly charming, and I cannot replicate
I think
it.
it's great. I think it's fabulous.
No, it's not that. It's the active listening noises. Have you guys listened to this? It is
They
wild.
had a whole episode of The Daily. Maybe it wasn't a whole episode. They had a comment in an early episode of The Daily that was about whether or not Michael Barbaro was aware of the fact that he did that. And they came on to tell us that, yes, he was aware and he did it on purpose.
I am aware. I think it is. Because the thing is, it's not just Barbaro. It is all of them. Every time they have a guest host, they do the exact same thing. Maybe they're all trying to like level set to his tempo, but they've all got this I think this is it. This is how we communicate interest to the audience, is just by inserting these weird moans over each other's comments.
But wait, but Scott, how will you multitask and do other things while pretending to listen to your colleagues?
Well, that is the challenge. But the truth is, once you multitask 2 ways, a third way doesn't really matter. And I'm making all sorts of weird sounds anyway. It's usually I just put myself on mute. Now it's just a matter of keeping it off mute.
See, I find that so obnoxious. And like, if I'm listening to an interview with somebody that I recorded, thank you, Scott. I do that a lot over the course of the interview to show.
Why would you find this annoying?
Well, no, yeah, right. So, if I'm interviewing someone over the phone, if they're, they've been talking for a while, sometimes I'll be like, to like let them know, like, I'm still here and I'm interested in what you're saying. But then when you go back and listen to it later to transcribe it, it's like, oh my God, this is awful. I'm being so obnoxious.
I just like to eat while doing interviews. So it's not active listening noises. It's just chewing noises.
It's a mukbang video.
Exactly. Yeah.
My dream product that I hope somebody does online is that they start editing an alternative audio feed of The Daily where they take out the active listening noises and insert like Muppet noises, like Hannibal saying, yeah, 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 which would be amazing. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Rational Security. I am one of your regular co-hosts, Scott R. Anderson, thrilled to be back here with my two other co-hosts, Quinta Jurassic.
Hello.
And Alan Rosenstein.
Hello, hello.
And to be joined once again by one of our favorite recurring guests, none other than Lawfare's executive editor, Natalie Orpett. Natalie, thank you for joining us again this week.
Thanks for having me, guys.
We are excited because we have a big agenda of heaping spoonful of national security items to talk through for this week, and what we are calling the active listening noises, a practice we will maybe selectively implement over the course.
Yeah, we're not going
podcast.
to.
Probably not. But the dream, though, maybe one day we'll see. For our first topic 1: does NSM stand for No Such Memo? Last week, in a long-awaited report required by National Security Memorandum 20, or NSM 20, that President Biden issued earlier this year, the Biden administration concluded that there were credible reasons to believe that Israel may well have violated international law and obstructed U.S.-backed humanitarian flows in its conduct in the war in Gaza, but still declined to find Israeli assurances to the contrary, lacking credibility enough to interrupt U.S. security assistance. What does this tell us about the state of U.S. support for Israel in the course of this conflict, especially as Israeli forces appear increasingly set to pursue an offensive on Rafah that Biden has openly opposed? Topic 2. What to expect when you're not expecting? A sharp global decline in birth rates, often below replacement levels, especially but not exclusively in highly developed countries, has some academics and policymakers panicking about everything from the global balance of power to the future of social support systems. But are these concerns misplaced, and how, if at all, should we be thinking about the relationship between national security and family planning? And topic 3, Azerbaijan scam. The Justice Department has indicted a second Democratic legislator, Representative Henry Cuellar of Texas, for working as an unregistered agent of a foreign government, among other crimes, this time that of Azerbaijan, even as a federal court in New York seats a jury for the prosecution of Senator Bob Menendez for allegedly doing the same on behalf of Egypt and Qatar. Is this reflective of a broader problematic trend, and what should policymakers be doing about it? For our first topic, Quinta, let me hand it over to you to get our conversation started.
On Friday, after quite a bit of delay, the State Department released a report on compliance with international humanitarian law by countries receiving U.S. weapons. There are a number of countries on that list, but the one that everyone really cares about right now, and I think it's fair to say the reason that NSM 20 came into existence to begin with, has to do with U.S. aid to Israel. And so there was a lot of speculation about what would be in this document. The final report is sort of mealy-mouthed. It does say, and I quote, "It is reasonable to assess that defense articles covered under NSM 20 have been used by Israeli security forces since October 7th in instances inconsistent with Israel's IHL obligations or with established best practices for mitigating civilian harm," end quote. But then the report declines to reach any legal conclusions that would prevent future weapons transfers. And it also says that Israel has been allowing humanitarian aid into Gaza, which was a big question mark, I think, over this report when it was initially being put together. So I think we can look at this in a couple ways. One is the sort of bureaucratic question that may be of interest only to rational security listeners of the particular mechanics of NSM 20, why it came to be, why this has been designed in this particular way, why the State Department has a role here. And we can also look at it in terms of the bigger question of, you know, what it means for U.S.-Israel relations and what it might signal about how the Biden administration is sort of trying to triangulate. So, Scott, with all that on the table, what do you make of this?
So I think this report is kind of what we expected, and we've been discussing the last few weeks, which is it's something that I think builds political pressure on the Biden administration, on Israel potentially, to begin to scrutinize some of what's happening in Gaza, or frankly, do more scrutiny, as I think we've already seen the level of scrutiny ramp up pretty substantial in the last few months, but doesn't really compel a cutoff. I don't think anyone should really be surprised by this necessarily, for three different reasons. One, the first is that it's really got a fairly narrow scope. It's specifically designed to address have U.S. defense articles, meaning like equipment, been used in specific incidents. So there's a big potential dodge, which we do see happening in this memo, where they say, well, yeah, there have been incidents where Israeli forces have done this. It's harder for us to say with certainty that U.S. weapons were used in these cases, although they acknowledge several cases where there's credible reason to believe that. And certainly they acknowledge that it's likely that that occurred. Then the question is, well, how do you assess these different things, both the compliance with international law and the factual accounts? And the truth is that making these sorts of determinations is really difficult because the application of these with any certainty, because the application of these standards requires judgment calls by policymakers, by war fighters, applying legal standards, often ex ante, to a particular military operation. You don't always have full visibility as to what information they were operating under when they make that decision. Even where you do get it, there's a fair amount of judgment call in the way at least most national governments apply these sorts of standards. And perhaps more importantly, like you're just stuck relying on circumstantial evidence. Now, you get enough circumstantial evidence, you can get to the point where a jury would convict and say, yeah, there's enough circumstantial evidence to suggest that this person really didn't know this was wrong or this really was happening. But where that threshold is a little unclear. There's no defined legal standard for any of this, right? It's like whatever we think is necessary to say we no longer find assurances credible. And that's kind of the third part of this, is that this all boils down to really an assessment about how these assurances work out. Like, what does it mean that Israel says this? Does that mean we need 100% compliance with them or not? And, I think it's not necessarily surprising, given the Biden administration has approached this, where they're not willing to say, we don't find these at all credible. Instead, but they do seem to be acknowledging, and in a way that I think puts pressure on them and on the Israelis potentially, they do acknowledge that there's real problem points here. And I suspect we're going to see, or at least hear of, a lot of bilateral engagement around those pressure points. Certainly they say that's going to continue as much in the report. The real question is that happening at a level that people find acceptable or that people think will be effective, given these policy goals, particularly Congress? Because remember, this memo was issued under pressure from members of Congress who want to do a legislative solution, which would be much more problematic for the administration and potentially Israelis. And then the other question is, is it enough to satisfy outside audiences? I suspect the answer is no, because those sorts of diplomatic engagements are rarely done in kind of full view of the public, nor do they result in like kind of sharp lines or sharp changes that a lot of people seem to be urging. So I don't think the Biden administration thinks it's standing still on this. I think they think this memo is like sending a strong signal, but it's not the sort of hard line, sharp divide that a lot of people were hoping for or wanting, particularly those skeptical of Israeli military actions in Gaza. And for that reason, I think is going to be seen by most people, particularly on the outside, as a continuation of the Biden administration's broad support for Israel.
Yeah, I think part of the issue here, as you indicated, Scott, with the history of where this memo came from and what it was in response to, and the moment it comes out, how it's being perceived, really this comes down to an issue where it's not clear whether what is needed here is the law or policy. And really, I think that the major problems that Congress was identifying in wanting to come up with legislation that ended up resulting in this memo, a lot of the public pressure that is out there, those are really matters of addressing problems with the policy that the Biden administration is holding toward Israel. Because if you are really looking for the law to be responsible for resolving the issue, it really requires doing a lot more of a deep dive into what the actual law is. And it's a lot messier and a lot more complicated. And as you sort of gestured at, it's a very difficult fact-specific analysis that has layer upon layer of problem, right? Because most of what we're talking about based on the language of the memo and the language of the report is IHL, International Humanitarian Law. But it is not only that. And to the extent we are also talking about, for example, compliance with the Leahy Law, that's about gross human rights violations, which is actually a different body of law than IHL. And there are parts of the memo and the report that refer to international law more broadly, which can talk about other types of law. So, which compliance are we talking about? And before we even get to the question of whether we are assessing it in a way that everyone was comfortable with, for which the answer will undoubtedly be no. Even if you are focused only on IHL compliance, that is a very, very difficult assessment that is extremely fact-specific, not only in the sense of you need the information that is very hard to actually obtain, but also in the sense that it's really an attack by attack analysis, and it is based, if you're doing a real IHL analysis, it is supposed to be based on what the relevant commander knew at the time. It's based on a balancing of various factors, the principles of IHL, I'm sure most people are familiar with: distinction, proportionality, precaution. There's a lot of subjectivity in there, but with objective guidelines of rules. The objective guidelines themselves are not very well established, and there is a little bit more specific guidance when it comes to what constitutes a war crime. But there's a delta between what is an IHL violation and what is a war crime, and this memo asks for assessments of IHL violations. So all of this is to say, in a very long-winded way, that it's not clear exactly who is looking for what in terms of assessing Israel's behavior with U.S. weapons and whether they will be satisfied by the type of analysis. And my suspicion here is that a lot of people are aspiring to accomplish different things with this memo and are understanding the report in different ways based on what they are trying to get out of it.
Can I just ask both of you actually a very basic question about this memo, which is, and maybe this is naive, but I'll just ask it anyway. To what extent is are these conclusions the good faith conclusions of the IHL and other legal experts and factual experts at the State Department, versus how much of this is the White House told someone at State, or State figured out that what the White House wants is a memo that does not, or that minimally interferes in the White House's ability to provide whatever level of aid it wants to Israel. Now, again, I'm not that naive. I understand that in government, it's, especially within the executive branch, all legal determinations are a complex blend of good faith legal interpretation and politics. This is true of OLC, it's true of L, it's true of everyone. But I'm just curious, in this particular case, what you two, or Quinta as well, make of this document in that respect.
Well, so we got some reporting on this in the weeks leading up to this memorandum coming out, particularly from the State Department, where the indication was you had several bureaus where what ends up happening with big reports or determinations like this, essentially, that are kind of assigned to the Secretary of State, and if assuming he doesn't subdelegate them to somebody else, is that you get what's called a decision memo, which is where various input offices with relevant kind of policy equity in the particular matter clear on a memorandum, try and reach consensus on a particular position. And if they can't, then the decision points, the points of disagreement, are teed up for a decision by the appropriate policy principal, in this case, the Secretary of State. This is what reportedly was happening, where you had certain bureaus, Democracy, Rights, and Labor Bureau, I think was specifically named, having said, we think these facts as alleged do reach these legal standards. The Office of Legal Advisor in my former office reportedly saying neutral in the matter. I don't find that surprising, I think, on a matter like this, particularly because there is a very fact-heavy assessment. They would probably see their role much more as laying out the requisite legal standards and leaving it to policymakers to make the factual assessments as to whether they met those standards or not. But regardless, the Office of Legal Advisor remaining neutral, and other offices reportedly opposing and saying we shouldn't find this conclusion that this has been, that these assurances are no longer credible, or that there's been a disruption of humanitarian flows. Notably, they said that they acknowledge there has been a disruption of humanitarian flows, is that they haven't necessarily concluded that they were arbitrary, which is what the statute in question, the portion of the Foreign Assistance Act, requires. So, that's the sort of key process. So this ultimately comes down to Secretary Blinken. He's the person who does make this decision. Does he make it in consultation with the president or not? That's sort of the question. I think historically, you've had periods where at times cabinet officials or lower officials have said, well, I have this responsibility in statute, or in this case, by virtue of this memorandum, this executive order, that I have to make this determination, and maybe I'll use this opportunity to pressure the rest of the government towards a position I like more. Or maybe I'll say I have to reach this conclusion. I don't think I can do it. If the president wants to fire me, he can fire me, but I have to reach this conclusion, right? Those moments are rare. I would say exceptionally rare. I think most of the time, there's a high degree of coordination and kind of ironing out common positions between what the principal decides is right and what their boss decides is right. This isn't a case, though, where it's automatic implementation of the idea of the unitary executive. Like, the president's not going in there and writing this memo and saying, this is the conclusion you have to reach. I think if that were to happen, you'd hear a lot of uproar from the State Department and potentially from others involved. And in fact, that's why Congress often structures statutes like this to make these decisions responsible for lower ranking officials, is precisely to be able to put more pressure on the administration itself by putting the credibility and the decision-making of a lower, more specialized body that has a lot more career civil servants in it with a voice to stand against maybe what the key administration position is. And this was an effort, again, to replicate that sort of model just through an executive order that normally you would see in a statute or something like that.
I'll just add one quick thing to this, which is that the report does mention, but of course, for obvious reasons, can't get into, the intelligence community assessment, which is, part of the difficulty with this report is, of course, that there is relevant information that should go into the calculus about whether there have been IHL violations or other violations of international law of concern. But some of the data for that fact-specific inquiry may be in the intelligence community's possession. We just don't know. We don't know how much, but it is undoubtedly the case that it would not be released in the interest of complying with the terms of this memo or being responsive to congressional concerns. So there is sort of, in my mind, a silent element here that we just don't have a lot of insight into that may complete the picture.
I will say, following the news about U.S. weapons transfers to Israel following this report, it feels a little bit like being jerked around. So we had this report come out sort of expressing concerns but not reaching any conclusions one way or the other. Then there was reporting that the Biden administration, or excuse me, I think this was earlier, that the Biden administration had decided it was going to hold off on transferring some heavy-duty 2,000-pound bombs to Israel out of concerns that they would be used in Rafah in a way that could endanger civilian life. And then there was additional reporting following that the administration had decided to go forward with some additional arms transfers after all. So I will confess I am having a little bit of trouble getting my head around how all of these things interact with one another. My understanding is that the bombs are a separate issue from the material described in NSM 20, but I'm not totally sure on that. So if anyone could explain this to me, I would be very, very grateful.
My understanding is just that the decision with respect to the bombs is a policy decision. I don't think it came with a determination that the use of these bombs would inherently be a violation of IHL. Therefore, prospectively, we can decide that their use would be contrary to the requirements of the memo. And I won't get into a whole aside into whether it's actually a complicated issue under IHL. There is, there are some IHL experts who say that siege warfare is per se a violation of international humanitarian law. There are others who say that it definitely is not. There are people who say that the use of very large weapons like this when the country using it has the technological ability to use more targeted weapons is a sort of violation in and of itself. And there are others who say, well, no, you can't have different standards for different states, and the evaluation of proportionality and distinction, for example, should be an objective one, not specific to what resources are available. So all of this feeds into, is this a legal determination that the use of those weapons would not be appropriate, or is it a policy decision that it is not something the U.S. wants to be responsible for having provided? My sense from the reporting is that it is very much the latter. And I suspect for all of the lots of lawyers with lots of specialized knowledge reasons, it is not something that would have come with a legal determination, or is even supposed to imply necessarily a legal determination that it would have been illegal to use them.
Yeah, I think that's right. Although I will say, I think those policy determinations may implicitly, but perhaps even kind of explicitly in policy discussions, incorporate a risk of an IHL violation, right? Like most things about decisions around, particularly like arms sales, arms transfer, security assistance, come down to policy decisions and lines, because the U.S. government rarely finds it in its interest to carve out where the hard lines are. International law doesn't permit where it doesn't have to. Instead, it says, we're going to withhold this for policy reasons. We're not going to reach the legal conclusion because a legal conclusion will bind us in the future. A policy conclusion is discretionary, and we can change that. So I think Natalie's 100% right. That's exactly what's happening here. It's worth noting, like, the whole NSM 20 process really only applies to a subset of arms. It doesn't apply to arms being used for self-defense. It doesn't apply to air defense systems. It doesn't apply to a lot of the other things. That probably accounts for a good chunk of the $1 billion that's going forward. Not all of it, though. I mean, clearly they did not reach the conclusion under NSM 20 that the assurances they were receiving were not credible. They weren't willing to reach that conclusion yet. And so a lot of these sales are willing to go forward for what is mostly, by my understanding, smaller ordnance weapons that would be used in the sort of ground assault the U.S. government has suggested is more appropriate because it is less of a danger to civilians. The biggest objection the Americans have made, and that frankly has been a criticism of the way Israel has pursued similar military campaigns in the past, has been the use of major ordnance against multi-use or infrastructure or buildings and infrastructure that is in dense urban areas like the Gaza Strip, most of the Gaza Strip. And that was the case with these 2,000-pound bombs. At least the New York Times quotes one senior U.S. official as saying that something like 90% of the ordnance that Israel used in the first few weeks of the Gaza conflict were 1,000 and 2,000 pounds bombs that are usually designed to take out whole buildings and whole complexes, not to do, super precision strikes. And the Biden administration has been clear. They're saying we're withholding these because we don't think this is the sort of weapon that's appropriate to be used in this sort of conflict. That's notable. I think that's significant. I think that's meaningful. Is it going to change the tenor or broad trajectory of the conflict? I don't think it is. Again, it's this idea that these are all warning shots getting closer to a much harder red line, which appears at present to maybe be the beginning of a serious military operation into dense urban parts of Rafah that the Israelis have resisted so far, but I seem to be inching closer to actually beginning to execute. And that will be a real crisis moment for the relationship. That's what this is all leading up to. Until then, this is all I think, signaling about smaller decisions, saying, don't push us further on this from the Biden administration to the Israelis. And the Israelis are trying to give the Biden administration an out, but still finding ways to kind of advance their objectives. And the Biden administration has been reluctant to draw hard lines, except around the items that most people agree raise big questions, like these 2,000 pounds bombs. The real question is, are they going to start drawing the red line further into areas that move away from those kind of more exceptional types of weapons and equipment towards more general use things on which Israel, frankly, is much more reliant?
Yeah, and I think there will be an interesting question also as to whether, as that line shifts, as it might, whether it will be with a rhetoric of what Israel is doing is wrong versus what Israel is doing is illegal, because those are different ways of framing the issue. And I think there are probably pros and cons of each one. So I'll be interested to see where, if it does indeed get there, the administration lands.
Well, going from a crisis of today, let us start thinking about a crisis that may be coming down the pike, according to some people in various academic and policy circles, or perhaps not. One of the things we want to talk about today, and that is the crisis or potential crisis of a decline in the global birth rate. There was an interesting article in the Wall Street Journal, which isn't the first article or the only article in this space, but the one that kind of brought it to our attention and is getting a fair amount of attention this week, and I thought made it a topic worth discussing, entitled, "Suddenly There Aren't Enough Babies, the Whole World is Alarmed," detailing the fact that birth rates are falling across a variety of countries, actually not just the kind of major developed countries that we've seen declining birth rates in throughout really the latter half or third of the 20th century up into the present day, but including in a number of other somewhat less developed countries, although still more on the developed end. Whereas the global birth rate dipping below the replacement rate, and many other countries' birth rates dip below the replacement rate. And perhaps most problematic for people who think this is a broader problem is that we've seen several states really actively wrestle with this problem, in particular Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and a few other countries, and install a variety of fairly aggressive policies, depending on how you look at it, about trying to incentivize people to have children over the last 10 to 20 years in particular. And most of those seem to have fallen short. In a few cases, you saw a temporary increase in birth rate, something that would last for a few years. But in most cases, they have now declined back down to kind of the place where they were on a trajectory towards before those policies were installed, suggesting not a lot of stickiness in the effectiveness of these policies. And so I think it's worth spending some time on I've seen the story getting picked up more and more kind of quarters. And frankly, it's something that is kind of a recurring story that pops up every few years. Although this time, some of the statistics do indicate this kind of accelerating trend. But how we should think about this relationship between birth rate and kind of families, right? Something that's one of the more intimate, domestic kind of personal concepts and decisions that people make, but has at least, and I think credibly by some implications, ramifications for nations. Natalie, why don't I start with you on this one? As you're the mother on the podcast, so I think you seem like a fair person to start on this topic. I don't know.
We're off to a great start, folks.
Wow, that is the most awkward question to you. We've been doing this for 3 years, Scottrick, and that is by far the most awkward question to you.
I don't think that's
of all time.
Is there a better way I should introduce it?
No, we're in it. We're committed. We're doing it. Natalie, respond.
Well, I'd be curious about how you react to this. Like, I think, frankly, like, it is a policy where we see a lot of like vocal people talk about this on a policy standpoint, right? Are like people who have very conservative social views. Donald Trump has described this as a national crisis.
Donald Trump does not have very conservative social views.
Well, I think that's a relative scale. J.D. Vance is somebody who's talked a lot about this, and the policy is being used in the sort of policy sphere. I'm curious about how exactly, these sorts of decisions fit into a political or policy sort of domain. Like, how should we be thinking about this and orienting this, both the geopolitical consequences and kind of the obviously ways it comes home and affects all of us individually in our lives?
Don't worry, Scott. We still love you as you turn beet red.
I didn't think it was that bad, but okay, apparently it was.
Well, I will start by saying that as I was perusing the internet to look at articles about this topic, I felt a real need to pull out my editing pen and change the headlines away from things like why are women rejecting motherhood to why are men making it harder for women to want to sacrifice their health and risk their lives and compromise their lifelong earning potential? But for some reason, no one wanted to have a headline like that. No, but in seriousness, I think the real takeaway here for me is that, as you say, no one has figured out a policy for being able to increase birth rates. There was a very interesting study that was cited in the Wall Street Journal article that you mentioned out of the University of Maryland that looked for explanations of the birth rate drop and looked across different states and found that there were no explanations from any of the usual suspects that become sort of part of the cultural discussion. So they looked at parental abortion notification laws, unemployment, Medicaid availability, housing costs, contraceptive use, religiosity, childcare costs, student debt. Almost none of them could explain the decline overall. There are obviously, this is happening worldwide. There are a lot of different social factors and pressures going on in other countries that are not identical to ours, and it is still happening all over the place. So I think my biggest takeaway is like, this is a great hook for people to want to impose their own value and cultural judgments and tee it to a trend that really social scientists do not seem to understand. And we may all have anecdotally our perceptions of why this might be and why people are having fewer babies worldwide. But like, really, does any of us know? The answer is pretty clearly not. So to the extent that you think that countries should be making policies on the basis of understanding what the problem is before they try to fix it, I think we're at a kind of hopeless moment.
I think I agree. I mean, I will say, I kind of came to this with the preconception of, of course, this is going to have to do with the fact that having children is expensive. There is often very little social support available. There's some really interesting research that's been done in South Korea, which has had a really stark birth rate decline such that it's below replacement level, where a lot of young women are sort of bowing out of the idea of having a family, in part because gender politics in South Korea, and particularly sort of, I don't even know what to call it. In the US, it would be, 5 years ago, it would have been men's rights activists, but essentially like far right sort of misogyny is so prominent in Korean society that a lot of young South Korean women just want nothing to do with it. But I agree. I mean, if you look at the extent to which this seems pretty like a pattern that repeats across a lot of different societies with a lot of different social structures, including in, Scandinavian countries, though less so there than elsewhere, it does seem like there's not an obvious, push this button to change the situation, even if the button is things that I otherwise would say are unmitigated goods, like, having more social support for families, more healthcare availability, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think a couple things come out of that. I am always on team, we need more data before we make a decision. And I definitely agree that it just seems like the social science at this point clearly identifies that this is happening, but does not clearly identify what policy levers are available to address it. I think that also means that the policy levers that people will point to are going to be things that they are inclined to want anyway for other reasons. So if you're on the left, you're going to say, more childcare, right? Child tax credit, universal pre-K, right? There's all kinds of things you can imagine, cheaper health insurance. If you're on the right, and I think you see this in a lot of the discourse from figures like the good Senator Vance, what you're going to argue is essentially a return to very traditional gender roles, because a lot of this transition comes along with higher education, more educational and career opportunities for women, and essentially attempting to push back against the choice that women are making to not have children. And I find that deeply concerning. The third point that I will make is that the coverage of this, to me, has seemed under-theorized in how it addresses why this is a problem and if it is necessarily a problem. And let me explain what I mean by that. The idea that we need to have a constantly growing population is a very recent thing that I think it's fair to say comes along with the sort of industrial revolution, the growth of, global capital and all that good stuff, and the idea that you need, more people to produce an economy that keeps growing, to produce more goods, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the reasons that you often see around why population decrease would be bad is that it would create economic problems, potentially. I have not seen any research, maybe I just haven't come across it, this is not my area, that actually digs into whether that is necessarily an outcome here. Like Japan, the population is flat or declining. I mean, their economy isn't doing great, but it hasn't tanked either. So is it necessarily the case that this will produce a massive global depression? Are there other bad outcomes that will necessarily follow from this, or are we just operating in the assumption that more people equals good? I don't want to fall into this sort of frankly anti-human trap of arguing that people should be gone from the earth and that will be better for everyone, which I think some sort of leftists back themselves into at some point. But I do think that there is kind of a bunch of unexamined or under-examined assumptions that are sort of undergirding this debate that I really think need to be dug into more. And the more we have this conversation, not we on this podcast, but culturally have this conversation without addressing those, the more I feel like it just veers into frankly weird and creepy stuff about why aren't women popping out more babies?
So Quinta, I agree that it's very important to identify why the problem is a problem before you try to solve it. I mean, I think there are at least a couple of reasons. One is I think there's actually just a kind of straightforward philosophical argument that in a world where, despite all the challenges we face politically, environmentally, etc., there's never been a better time to be a human being in the history of our species than today. Having more human beings, having more consciousnesses who can take advantage of this amazing moment of prosperity that, again, I think even with climate change, there's no reason to think that will fundamentally shift anytime soon, is itself a good, right? That's kind of the most abstract why you should have more people, because you have more happy babies who can become more happy children who become more happy adults. And I don't see why that should be a particularly controversial claim. But
no, I think that's
by all the faces. I'm seeing all the faces here.
I think
that is very controversial.
There's a huge difference between talking about what you owe to existing creatures and consciousnesses on the face of the earth and whether or not you owe it to something that doesn't exist to bring it into existence in the first place. That seems like a huge philosophical leap.
And I'm not saying that. But so I'm not arguing that you owe it to future generations, to non-existent beings to bring them into existence. But if the question is why might some people, right, who see a world of declining birth rates think, that's a bummer, right, or that's not a great thing, is because that is a bunch of people who could otherwise have lived very happy lives who did not, right? But that's just the philosophical, that's just a very abstract philosophical argument. You don't have to buy that argument, I think, to worry that a world of not just fewer people, right? But not just no longer a growing population, but rapidly shrinking population. And again, if you look at places like South Korea, this is not a soft landing. I mean, their fertility rate is, I think, below 1, which is just a crazy number. Is you get a horribly unbalanced demographic situation where you have a ton of elderly people who, because of better healthcare, are living longer than ever, which is a good thing, obviously, but they're not able to be particularly economically productive. You have a much smaller, productive labor base that causes huge economic problems, much less innovation. I mean, we've never had a society. I mean, you're right, Quinta, that this idea of population constantly growing is quite a recent phenomenon. But what we've never had is a population that's crashing. And the economic and social dislocations of that could be really profound. I think the other thing that I would say also is, obviously, if there are people who don't want to have children, they should not have children. But there is in the research a surprising number of people who say, I would like to have this number of children, but I only feel like I am able, right, because of whatever the case is, to have less numbers of children. So it's not, I think, if this was a matter of trying to convince people who don't want children to have children, I'd be much more sympathetic to like, I don't know, that's kind of creepy argument. But for a lot of people, it's, I want to have more children than I ultimately had, but, I wasn't able to because this or that life circumstance got in the way. And to be clear, that's not just a poll of men, right? That's if you ask women, plenty of women have that view as well. Again, not all, but we're looking at population size.
It is more men than women now.
It may be more men than women, but it's still a substantial portion of women.
Can I say, I mean, like, the thing that jumps out at me at this is that the most concrete problem case we have at this is like modern, for lack of a way to describe it, I don't really like saying it this way, but I'll call it social welfare states, right? Because they have been constructed upon a 20th century premise of a growing population. And so every generation is kind of borrowing against the economic performance of a future generation. And that's like a policy problem people have complained about for a while. But insofar as like that's the way our policies are set up, and a sudden decline in birth rate in certain major industrialized economies will be a problem, like there's a short rate fix for that, and that's immigration. Immigration causes cultural problems, maybe, but I think most of the problems don't really exist.
I dispute that.
I dispute that. I'm sure people argue, right? It has this political backlash.
I mean, no, it definitely can if it's not
But it's a
done
difference
well.
between trade-offs, about saying like, why is it a trade-off between, bringing in people into your socioeconomic community that will support the, whatever this economic structure is through, immigration, as opposed to having children, Frankly, immigration's probably economically a lot better way because you can bring them in when they're already adults and you don't have to deal with the cost of raising them, right?
But this is what gives the game away. This is what gives the game away because JD Vance wants
I totally agree.
white women to have more babies.
But Quinta, if I may ask, and this is my standard line on our security, who gives a shit about what JD Vance says? Like, I am extremely uninterested in interrogating the whether the far right or the right is arguing good faith, because they're not. I'm happy to grant that.
They're not.
But there's a substantively interesting question that I think the left, because it's so often unwilling to have this conversation, is end up ceding what I think is a really important issue to the right. And that's like really unfortunate. And I think like, just to make a meta point, like the clear discomfort that we're all having with this very conversation is an example of itself a problem, right? Because this is the sort of thing that I think the left like needs to be able to talk about and not just cede it to the right.
Yeah, I'm not uncomfortable, but yeah, please go ahead, Quinta.
I'm happy to talk about it in terms of more support for families in a variety of ways, and also, all kinds of interventions that could allow having children to not, as Natalie mentioned earlier, put women at a lasting penalty over the course of their lives in terms of career outcomes, earning potential, so on and so forth. My concern is that, unfortunately, the far right has a lot of power in this country right now. And I think that we need to understand their portion of the conversation in context of a broader backlash against less traditional understandings of sex and gender that is attempting to pigeonhole people into more traditional cubbies, which takes a bunch of different forms. One of them, I would argue, is the overturning of Roe. But I don't think that we can have this conversation in the abstract without keeping in our minds the fact that the policy outcomes here have immediate effects on the lives of real people. And because the reason I'm picking on JD Vance is because he is a US senator and there is a 50% chance that Donald Trump will be the president come next January, and that, maybe Vance will be in a senatorial majority, and they will have the power to make policy on these bases. It matters.
Right. Just to echo Quinta, the reason that we have to give a shit what JD Vance says and what other people say, even if they're not saying it in good faith, is because they get to make the policy. They are part of the process of deciding what is going to be the policy, whether or not it is engaged in good faith. And, one of the examples of a place where they actually did manage to get the birth rate to increase for a short period was Romania, where they got rid of the right to abortion and they took away contraception. that's not a great policy outcome, though it got to an objective that some people have determined is necessary.
And it also led to many of those children being given up, put in orphanages, and severely socially and mentally,
and a huge increase in maternal mortality as well.
I think we can all agree that the Romanian model is rightly off the table.
Absolutely.
I'm just trying to figure out, as like, if you are of the center or the left and you think that sharply declining populations are a problem.
But I think you have to ask why you think it's a problem to make the case for that. Like, there are short-term, again, they're like policy concepts. I think the social welfare state argument is like a real one for like the next generation or 2 or 3, right? But you can restructure, and that's a hard one for the left and right, actually, right? Like, it's difficult for people to say, let's think about how to do our social welfare system differently. But that is a conversation you can have. You're just choosing policy trade-offs in a different way. And to put the emphasis to say, no, it's just birth rate, this is a problem, has implicit in it a shifting of cost and burden to, women in particular, anybody with a family more broadly, but particularly women. And, there are other ways you can conceive and address this. Like, I think it's not just that we all have to accept this as a problem. Now, I think there is a good argument. There might be problems with part of this. There might be reasons we want to have it the other way. But I think we can still have to problematize it and think about what the real trade-offs are policy-wise that we're talking about.
So am I the only one here? It's an honest question, so not meant to be snarky. Am I the only one who just intuitively thinks that a culture, and again, you have to do this across population, right? Any individual has to make a lot of choices that are very complicated for themselves, right? But as a culture, right, in which the perpetuation of the species, of the culture, of the whatever, right, that instinct is lost, and that culturally is no longer a norm, right? Not an oppressive requirement that everyone does, but a norm in the way that lots of things are norms, even if lots of people, for plenty of good reasons, decide to opt out of that norm. That's just a bummer of a culture. Like again, I'm not trying to pick on South Korea here, but it doesn't, to me, no matter how rich or successful or technologically advanced a culture is, and again, and not to blame any particular group either, if their replacement rate is 0.7, that to me says that there is something fundamentally malformed about that culture. Am I the only one who feels this just as an intuitive level? Maybe I am, in which case, like, we just have different intuitions here. I would have thought that intuition was wider spread, right? Again, totally separate from what do you do about this, and obviously don't go full Romania.
Yeah, it's interesting. The way you put it is actually one of the conclusions that came out of that study out of the University of Maryland is they found basically that the only possible explanation was relating to social values, right? They looked at whether this was, I'm trying to remember the term because this is an area of social science in which I am really not qualified to speak, but isn't that what we do here on Rational Security? That it was they're talking about this transition as I think it was a cohort effect rather than I forgot the other term, but it's like a point in time effect, where it's not that the circumstances have changed for everyone across the population all at once. It's that the people who are of childbearing age have a different set of values and interests, and so are choosing to have fewer children. So to the extent, yes, that as a personal values system matter that is concerning to any one individual, I think that's of course, that's totally fair. If you are a person who values families, who values small children and all of the, occasional joy that they can bring, then yes, absolutely, it's right to point to this as sort of a bummer of a cultural moment, as you say, Ellen. But if we're talking about it as a hair on fire, national security emergency or verge of economic crisis, blah, 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 sure, talk about that too. But if you don't know what to do about it as a policy matter, stop trying to impose your I forgot the way you put it, Quinta, but I thought it was very well said. Trying to impose your sort of other agendas using this as a hook. And it is especially difficult given that, this is an area where the prescriptions are very, very opposed, depending on whether you're on the right or the left. And I will, be fully transparent in a not surprising way that I find that the prescriptions from the right are totally abhorrent. And I find them personally, as a woman of childbearing age, offensive, because they would have a direct impact on me as an individual, notwithstanding my own personal values and assessment of this in a cultural sense, the way you say, Ellen.
I would also just add that, the idea of birth rate as being an indicator of anything, I think, is strange. Americans had a much higher birth rate in the 19th century because children died. And so you had to have a substantial number with hopes of any of them surviving to adulthood, right? That wasn't a sign of enthusiasm for American culture. It was a sign of horrendous broader conditions, right? And kind of the perseverance of hoping to have one or two kids to replace you. I think a much better indicator, something that would be concerning to me, this is a variable I care about, is that there are a lot more people who want to have kids. I think there are good reasons to have kids. I love having kids.
Sometimes. Don't pretend like you always love it. Most of the time.
I keep doing it, so I appear to be okay with it. It is, I think there's good reasons people want to do that. If they don't, I get that too. But if there were a lot of people who want to have children and can't, or feel like they can't for economic reasons, for social reasons, for things like that, I think that's a much bigger problem. I think that's a legit public policy problem because it comes down to the fact that, in the end, society is supposed to serve our happiness. And this is one way that some people might find a degree of life satisfaction. And if you're serving as short on that, but to me, that steers back to the idea of what are we doing to support families, not forcing up some arbitrary statistic that just doesn't correlate with the things we actually care about, which is the happiness of people. And that's why I tend to agree. I think the birth rate statistic is a used and abused one, not one that is as useful. Although I get the intuition to say why it's a problem. I feel that intuition, but I lose it when I start to dig into it a little bit more and think about what it actually means, I guess, is where I land.
Yeah, I think you're really, I think you're echoing what Quinta was saying earlier about really needing to question the underlying assumption of all of this, that it is a bad thing, sort of needs some examining.
Right. I think these conversations are difficult, often not emotionally difficult, although they can be a bit intellectually difficult, because it gets right to the core of, the question of what is a society for, right? Is it to produce more people? Is it to produce more capital and keep the economy running? Is it to make us all as happy as possible? How do we assess, whether my definition of happiness is better than your definition of happiness? And those are kind of the core questions of how we organize ourselves as this, right? There's a huge section of Plato's Republic about how families are bad and we should just raise everyone in a big, pen, and that will somehow fix things.
A series of pens, as I recall.
Just to be clear,
a hierarchy of pens.
Plato was pretty clearly wrong about it. That was a big swing and a miss on Plato's. Plato's part.
No. I'm just saying that questions about family formation are very core to a lot of deep questions that cannot, I would say, in a liberal society have one answer, which I think is why that's liberal in the sense of political liberal, obviously, not left-right, which is precisely why it's so difficult to get into, because you end up sort of immediately going to all of these questions about why are we here, which are just necessarily difficult to answer on the level of policy.
I will say, I actually think that it is also, it's not just an intellectually difficult problem, but I think it's also an emotionally difficult discussion. And I really do think the heightened tenseness of this segment, which is fine, I think actually just show that. And I think part of the reason is that it's not just a conversation about policy, it's a question about norms. It's a question about normativity, right? And one thing that liberals, and here I actually mean specifically liberals, right? So not conservatives and not progressives either, are often very uncomfortable in forcing any sense of social normativity, because they also value people's choice. And the interesting thing about birth rate and fertility and all this sort of stuff is because it's so socially mediated, because so many of us, it's not that we have kids because our friends are having kids, but obviously the being in a peer group of people having kids, right? That is a big part of it, right? And the norms of how many you have and how you raise them. You can't extricate this individual choice from the social norms. And it's that balance between, do we want to have social norms even knowing that some people will feel excluded from them, versus, well, we need to have, we have to have some social norms, otherwise there's no society. I think that's a big challenge. Also, more importantly, all your intuitions are wrong. This is not my object lesson, but everyone should go watch. This is
inevitably where this leads.
But everyone should watch. Everyone should watch the movie Children of Men, which is itself just a very interesting dystopic sci-fi movie about what happens if humanity suddenly stops being able to reproduce. Only one particular vision.
So is Handmaid's Tale. So trade-offs.
Was it because they first came up with policies that killed off all the women?
No, it's because it's never clear why, like, suddenly everyone becomes, like, men and women all become infertile. But it's a very interesting movie. It's a good Alfonso Cuarón. Anyway, moving from difficult, complex, morally, ethically charged issues to extremely not complex, not morally charged, absolute shit shows. Let's talk about how do we even cue this up? Apparently, I didn't realize this until reading the news coverage about it. The first two sitting congresspeople in history to have been indicted while being in Congress for being agents of a foreign power, two Democrats, no less. And we should definitely talk about the political valence of this once we get past the actual indictments themselves. It's very interesting. You have on the East Coast, represented ably by by the senator that America deserves, even if it doesn't need, Bob Menendez of the Gold Bullion.
Gold bars Menendez to you.
Bob Gold bars. So much for wife guy Menendez. And then in Texas, Henry Cuellar representing the kind of western part of the country. In the New Jersey, you got the Egyptians. In Texas, you have, is it the Azerbaijanis? The Azerbaijanis. I mean, there's a lot to get into this. I do want to obviously start with you, Quinta, because you are our proud New Jerseyan, big Bob Menendez fanboy. I mean, you have that shrine right behind you, I can see, to all things Bob Menendez. How are you feeling about it? I mean, we're getting jury selection. I mean, are they going to bring the gold bars like into the courtroom? I hope so.
Yeah, we were discussing that this morning. I will say The Onion had a very good article about Menendez trying to jam a gold bar into the vending machine at the courthouse, which I appreciated. Good. I would love if they actually brought the gold bars in as evidence. I don't know if they will do that.
So it's a little prejudicial.
Maybe a little bit. There was also, this is from a CBS News report, and shout out to our colleague Molly Reynolds, who is equally obsessed with this case, for bringing this to my attention, where during jury selection, one juror told the judge, and I quote, "I personally just don't like him very much. He represents everything that I find repugnant about American politics, and I don't think that I can't even say it, I don't think that I could be fair or impartial." Shout out to this juror. You know what? Points for honesty. I don't disagree. Yeah,
of course, that juror ended up being picked because every single juror had that reaction. They couldn't disqualify all of them.
Right. Exactly. Look, at least they're holding the trial in New York. But yeah, so Henry Cuellar is here. He is trying to steal New Jersey's thunder. Interestingly, I believe So Cuellar was indicted alongside his wife and a number of his staffers, and I believe we've already actually seen some guilty pleas in the Cuellar case, which I think is interesting. Menendez, there's been one guilty plea from one of the co-defendants who is alleged to have been involved in this scheme, so we'll see how those cases play out. So far, Cuellar does not appear to have adopted the strategy of throwing his wife under the bus. He is still standing by his wife.
Wife guy to the end.
Yeah, I know, exactly. Well, we'll see if the wife guy makes it through. I do think there is a really different political valence to each of these cases, because the thing about New Jersey is that Donald Trump's insistence to the contrary, there is no chance that this is a state that will send a Republican to the Senate. We do elect Republican governors, but Senate, not so much, and president, certainly not. So for Menendez, there's been a really tense Democratic primary with people kind of slugging it out over who's going to take the seat that everyone is assuming that he will vacate. And because, the assumption is that it will be a Democrat. And I think there's actually a very strong Democratic candidate, Andy Kim, who seems likely to triumph there, who I will say, just on the level of, not being corrupt, but also generally having been, very civic-minded member of the House, seems like he would, be a perfectly decent senator.
Featured in episode 1 of The Aftermath, season 1.
Exactly. There you go. But you're swapping out a Democrat for a Democrat, and the relative, value of the specifics of that Democrat can vary, but it's a solidly blue seat. Cuellar is interesting because he is in a swing district. He might be the only pro-life Democrat in the House. He was primaried last time around. The primary challenger lost. He was not primaried this time around. I do wonder if the Texas Democrats are kind of regretting that now. Yeah. And he said that he's going to continue running for the seat. But so if he loses, and I don't know anything about the Republican candidate, but if he loses, we obviously have very tight margins in the House right now. You can imagine a scenario in which Cuellar's indictment helps take the House away from Democrats, or, eats into a margin that they could be running up. So it could have, real political significance beyond the fact of, the alleged corruption, which is also very bad.
I'm curious about, in terms of it's funny because when I mentioned the political valence, I was thinking less about the immediate electoral implications for these two races and more about the fact that now you have, in pretty short succession, 2 high-profile acts of real bad corruption by Democratic politicians. And, in a race where I think a big part of the Democratic strategy is to paint Donald Trump, rightly as a corrupt threat to democracy. I mean, this all went back to that Ukraine call in a sense, right? It doesn't help, I think, or I'm curious. I mean, I see a vulnerability for Democrats here. I'm curious what you all think.
I mean, maybe, I don't know. I actually don't know if House Democrats have stood by Cuellar. The Democrats in the Senate were pretty quick to throw Menendez under the bus. He lost his seat as chairman of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee. He does not have a lot of fans in there right now. And there were a lot of statements immediately from Democrats, condemning the allegations and so on and so forth. Again, I'm not sure about Cuellar, but this was certainly the case with Menendez. I think it's harder for the Republicans to attack him because Trump is out there arguing that doing this thing is like great and awesome and just how everything works. And he's being unfairly, criticized for his own insane corruption. Like he after Cuellar was indicted, posted something on Truth Social saying like, the corrupt Biden Justice Department is going after, Representative Cuellar because he refuses to go along with the border scam or something like that, right? Like he was defending Cuellar. And so I think that actually makes it a lot more difficult for the Republicans to make hay out of this.
So there's an interesting piece in Politico talking about how Republicans were hoping to do that with Cuellar's seat, which I thought was interesting, where they're essentially saying they want to try and leverage it because his seat was actually not a seat they were targeting. I don't know what his margin was that he won by, but it wasn't even on their targeting list. And it sounds like it still isn't. Instead, there are 2 other, or at least one, I think 2 other nearby seats that are held by Democrats along the border that they're instead targeting. And they're trying to leverage his indictment against those candidates by basically saying, hey, are you going to condemn this guy or not? They're hesitant to condemn him because they are political allies. They build on a similar kind of base of support, machine, if you want to call it that, in South Texas, where there are people who are going to be compromised by that, and where, some people might still support Cuellar. So it puts them in a difficult position. And it sounds like, at least as the time Politico ran this piece, I think yesterday, neither of them had come out publicly and condemned Cuellar or really said anything else. But I think this points to what the right answer is, which is that the party should, as I think they actually did this time with Menendez, and kind of a departure from the last time Menendez was indicted 10 years ago, came out very strongly and pretty early, maybe not quite early enough in Tapes' leadership, but pretty early, and said, no, man, hey, if you got to step down for your leadership roles. And if you are convicted of this, this is bad stuff. I mean, I think you got to acknowledge everybody has a right to launch a legal defense, et cetera, et cetera. Innocent until proven guilty. But at the same time, that doesn't entitle you to a leadership position. And if you have really credible evidence against somebody that something that they've done is wrong, you can say that doing that is wrong and bad, and it should not be a member of our party. And I actually think Democrats have stepped up on this, and I don't think it's a coincidence. I think they do it in part in reaction to the Trump years because corruption has become such an underlying theme, where now it is easier to paint them as hypocrites if they weren't to come out as stances on this. And I think they have, and I suspect they will with Cuellar. Maybe it takes a little more time, even with his kind of other folks along the border who might otherwise have political reasons to feel it as painful. That was the case with Menendez, as I recall, under his first indictment. Like, a lot of New Jersey politicians would not come out and condemn him or oppose him. They stayed pretty silent about it because he was such an integral figure in the kind of fundraising, political organizing machine that so many Democratic politicians used in New Jersey. And it sounds like maybe Cuellar is in a similar position. I'm not sure. But like, that's not a good enough excuse. Like, a National Party leadership should be taking, the first step forward in this. And Republicans should too, for the record, as well, saying this sort of behavior is inappropriate. And it should be condemned, pretty out from the outset, I think, much more strongly. And thankfully, at least, I do think Democrats have been moving in that direction.
There's obviously like the politics of this and the circus of this, and I'm with you, Quinta, man. Like, I'm on team gold bars. But, there is kind of a substantive question of like, why does this keep happening? And obviously, 2 points makes a line. It doesn't make a massive trend, but like, it's still, these are very serious offenses. And they have happened now twice in reasonably quick succession. Now, I think you can look at it in one of two ways. You can say, DOJ and FBI are really good at their jobs. They're doing investigations. This stuff has probably always taken place throughout American history, and we're just being really rigorous about finding it. Or one can say, there's something happening. Maybe it's something within Congress generally. Maybe it's something within the Democrats. But, if you're a congressperson, it shouldn't be very hard not to become an agent of a foreign power. And yet this keeps happening. So what do we make of this?
Who among us hasn't become an agent of a foreign power?
Yeah. Excuse me while I count my gold bars in the other room.
No, I do think there is an element, and I believe the Times had some reporting on this and about Cuellar. There's an element of just like, you're in DC, you're hobnobbing with people who are very rich and have a lot of money, and you kind of want to keep up. Frankly, I think there's a similar dynamic with the Clarence Thomas story, although there's no allegation there about foreign money. And that there's just an incentive to kind of, allow yourself to be wined and dined a bit, which isn't good. And to be clear, the majority of members of Congress seem to manage to avoid breaking the Foreign Agents Registration Act. As far
I live
as
in
we
DC
know.
and I never interact with rich people.
That's right. Well, you don't know about my gold bars.
You have two small children. You never interact with anybody.
I don't
It's
interact
fine.
with anyone. That's fair enough. Fair enough.
Yeah, I think in addition to the whining and dining, which I agree, Quinta, that was a funny aspect of that article that I think I read as well. It was interesting to me to learn a little bit about the Azerbaijani influence in Texas state and national politics. So especially at the state level, because I just didn't realize that Azerbaijan has a presence as much as it does in Texas, or seems to, which relates, insofar as I can tell, almost entirely to the state-owned oil company, which is run by the seems quite despotic leadership of Azerbaijan. But in addition to economic interests in the oil and gas industry, there seemed to be a lot of lobbying around the conflict with Armenia that's been going on for decades. And so I think there's an interesting question too, and this is something we've sort of covered in various ways in Lawfare, is how at the state and sometimes local level, officials are touching on foreign policy issues. And, to what extent was the perception that, okay, there are these issues going on within my state. There are people who have, the local Azerbaijani presence has an American interest, has a foothold in my district. Therefore, it's sort of constituent services. And then that sort of snowballs to becoming something completely different and becoming an agent. That's not quite the slippery slope that I think anyone could just accidentally fall into. It is an interesting sort of supplement to the question of why is this happening. And I will say, Alan, I think my understanding is that FARA enforcement has gone way, way up, which may be a reason for this. It may also just be that once you're looking for FARA enforcement, it's easy to, then find violations of the bribery statute and stuff like that. So it may just be that it is less a new phenomenon or an increasing phenomenon than it is just a question of enforcement. But I don't think any of us really knows or has the data to know for sure.
Well, folks, that brings us to the end of our time together this week. But this would not be Rational Security if we did not leave you with some object lessons to ponder over in the week to come. Alan, what do you have for us this week?
So my object lesson, and I will say there was a lot of fighting over who got this object lesson in our Slack, is rest in peace Alice Munro, who died at the age of 92 on Monday. For those of our listeners who are not familiar, Munro is one of, if not the greatest short story author of the last 100 years. I think you have to go back to like Chekhov to find someone who I think is, wrote kind of her caliber of fiction. She won the Nobel Prize. She won all these awards. And her stories are just so good. It's kind of amazing. She had this very long career. She wrote so many short stories. In one sense, it's all kind of one story. Like she kind of retells the same set of stories and themes about this like little corner of rural southwestern Ontario, basically right across from Michigan. And yet in this like incredibly small canvas, there's the richness, the beauty of her prose. It's incredible. I haven't read her short stories in a long time, but I went through this I went through this 6 months where all I did was read Alice Munro at like my late 20s. I don't know why. I have to go back and reread this stuff. You can pick any book of her short stories. You can start anywhere. It's an amazing, amazing corpus of work and a real. She lived an amazing life. She wrote amazing stuff. It's sad, obviously, but it's more, I think, an opportunity to celebrate truly one of the great writers of modern English literature. So, yeah, or Anglophone literature, as the case may be. Also, go Canada! Canada punches above its weight when it comes to literature. So good for the Canadians. You put her on your currency. I'll end with that. Put her on a loonie.
Well, congrats, Canada. Quinta, what do you have for us this week?
Yes, for the record, I was the person who was fighting with Alan over who would get to have Alice Munro.
I called it first.
Yes, he called it first.
Is it bad that the first thing I saw when I saw that Alice Munro had died was really sad, and I have to get on Slack because I need to see my object lesson. I have to beat Quinta.
That's how much we love Alice Munro here on Rational Security. Yes, I have a completely different object lesson, which is a little blessed from the past during the Trump New York trial. It is the resolution of a mystery that has been running since 2017 that has to do with Michael Cohen and Prague. So if you, dear listener, cast your mind back to the winter of 2017, you may recall the release of a certain little document called the Steele Dossier that included some salacious rumors about Trump. One of the components of the dossier was an allegation that Michael Cohen had traveled to Prague at some point to, somehow collude or engage in shenanigans related to the Russian government and the Trump campaign. At the time, Michael Cohen said he had never been to Prague. And this week, under oath in a New York courtroom, he was asked, somewhat strangely by Trump's defense counsel, I'm honestly not quite sure what Todd Blanche was getting at there. He asked Michael Cohen, have you ever been to Prague? And Michael Cohen said no, he had not. I thought this was the first time he had said this under oath. Apparently, he also said it under oath during a congressional hearing in 2018. But now it's double under oath. The mystery has been resolved. People, despite just a truly incredible amount of reporting and angsting over and not whether Michael Cohen had been to Prague, which was like a major thread of reporting on the Russia investigation for a long time, I think we now know it for certain. He was never in Prague. I hear it's a nice city.
My recollection is Michael Cohen saying things under oath is not 100%
yeah, well,
certainty
we'll
of accuracy.
see if he's prosecuted for perjury.
It does seem like a better indicator, if nothing else. For my object lesson this week, I'm dipping back into the object lesson annals in that the last few summers, I have celebrated one of my greatest loves for summer outdoor cooking, and that is pizza grilling. But I always send it at the end of the summer, and people complain, I didn't have time to do this, so I'm doing it right now at the beginning of the summer. I shared a secret of my pizza grilling secrets and recipes on prior object lessons on Rational Security, and on Twitter. I will re-up those and reconnect them in the show notes for folks. But perhaps more importantly, for that reason, as I am rehashing an old object lesson, I'm going to cede my object lesson time to none other than our producer, Noam Osband, who has an event coming up. We thought some people in DC, particularly of Rational Security listeners, might be interested in. Noam, let me hand it over to you.
I'm coming to DC on May 23rd to perform in a show at the DC Improv. The show is entitled Freaks and Geeks, and people are going to be reciting stories about their childhood. So it's going to be a combination of Story District, which is a DC storytelling show, and then Mortified, where people read their childhood writings. I'll be reading some randy childhood poetry that uses a variety of Talmudic terms. and a letter that my father sent me when I was in summer camp at age 14, where he was very unhappy with me talking about believing in Satan and skinny dipping. It's a really fun show. It's really fun to hear people recite their weird childhood, adolescent experiences. And that's going to be at the DC Improv on May 23rd at night. Come on out.
All right. Well, hopefully folks in DC can make out. For those who don't know, Noam is a true polymath. He is a Jeopardy champion, a Philadelphia Eagles troubadour, and otherwise a very talented individual. I'm sure storytelling is among those talents as well. Meanwhile, let us bring it to Natalie Orpett to bring us home. What do you have for us for object lessons this week?
Okay, so this is a bit random, but on the occasion of planning with our colleagues who have opened a bureau in New York to cover the day-to-day grind of the Manhattan District Attorney's case against former President Donald Trump, I have had occasion to think a lot about logistics and living in New York, which I used to do for 7 years before moving to DC, which caused me to revisit my favorite ever Onion article in the history of time, which is from 2010, but holds up so well. I will just read the first paragraph, and then I will not be able to read anymore because I will start laughing uncontrollably. So you'll just have to go finish it yourself. At 4:32 p.m. Tuesday, every single resident of New York City decided to evacuate the famed metropolis, having realized it was nothing more than a massive, trash-ridden hellhole that slowly sucks the life out of every one of its inhabitants. So I really recommend this article. If you've lived in New York, especially, well, I should say, if you have lived in New York and left, you will find it especially vindicating and hilarious. If you still live in New York City, you will find it to be deeply true and upsetting, and you will realize how much you have to delude yourself into getting through every single day. And then you will promptly forget about this article and all of its revelatory truth.
Well, folks, that brings us to the end of this week's episode. Rash Security is, of course, a production of Lawfare. So to be sure to visit us at lawfaremedia.org for our show page with links to past episodes, for our written work and the written work of other Lawfare contributors, and for information on Lawfare's other phenomenal podcast series, including The Aftermath, with the last episode now available. While you're at it, be sure to follow us on Twitter or X at RATL Security, and be sure to leave a rating or review wherever you might be listening. And sign up to become a material supporter of Lawfare on Patreon for an ad-free version of this podcast and other special benefits. For more information, visit lawfaremedia.org/support. Our audio engineer and producer this week was Noam Osband of Goat Rodeo, and our music, as always, was performed by Sophia Yan. We were once again edited by the wonderful Jen Patcha. On behalf of my co-hosts Alan and Quinta and our special guest Natalie Orpett, I am Scott R. Anderson, and we will talk to you next week. Till then, goodbye.